The aliens thought they understood war. They had studied it for centuries, refined it into a precise science. Every battle followed calculations, every soldier trained to suppress fear and follow logic. But when they faced humans, something didn't add up. The numbers should have made sense. Humans should have broken, retreated, surrendered. Instead, they fought harder. And when the aliens finally uncovered what truly turned humans into ruthless warriors, it sent chills through their entire species. It started with a single mistake. The Zokari Empire, a cold and calculating race, had clashed with humans on the outer fringes of explored space. To them, it was just another skirmish, another civilization to subdue. They had crushed countless others before, species that had never stood a chance. At first, the war against humanity followed the same pattern. The Zokari struck fast, wiping out forward bases, overwhelming defenses, targeting key supply chains. Their analysts predicted human resistance would crumble within weeks. It didn't. Instead, something changed. The reports from the front lines grew alarming. Human soldiers were fighting with an intensity the Zokari had never seen before. Their strategies evolved in unpredictable ways, their attacks became relentless, and their morale never wavered. Even when outnumbered, they held the line. Even when facing certain death, they refused to break. The Zokari commanders were baffled. Numbers alone couldn't explain it. Then the unthinkable happened. The Zokari made what should have been a decisive blow, an attack that should have ended the war in their favor. They struck a human colony, not just a military outpost, but a place where civilians lived. To them, it was a calculated move. A lesson. Break their morale by showing them the cost of resistance. That was how war worked. But what happened next defied every calculation. The humans changed. The reports from the battlefield spoke of something different now. Their movements became sharper, more coordinated. Their endurance stretched beyond normal limits. Soldiers who should have collapsed from exhaustion fought on as if something far greater than themselves drove them forward. And the way they fought, it wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't even just about winning. It was personal. The kind of personal that sent a cold shiver through every Zokari commander watching from afar. This wasn't war as the Zokari knew it. This was something else. And then the realization struck them like a thunderclap. The mistake they had made wasn't just strategic. It was psychological, cultural, something so deeply ingrained in the human species that no alien empire had ever accounted for it before. The Zokari had unknowingly crossed the one line that should never have been touched. Now, the humans weren't just fighting a war. They were hunting. And the Zokari weren't ready for what was coming next. The Zokari command centers buzzed with uneasy energy. Every battle before had been predictable. Enemy morale would break, surrender would follow. But humans didn't break. They changed. And the reports from the front lines were becoming harder to believe. Zokari analysts reviewed battle footage, searching for an explanation. There had to be a pattern, something to quantify, something logical. But what they saw unsettled them more than any statistic ever could. Human soldiers who had fought defensively before now attacked with terrifying precision. They moved like they had nothing left to lose, like they had made a decision beyond survival. Their faces, once strained with exhaustion, were now set with an intensity that no Zokari could comprehend. Something had awakened in them. The turning point had been the colony. It was meant to be a demonstration of force, a calculated blow to sap human resolve. Instead, it had ignited something primal. Something the Zokari had never accounted for in their centuries of warfare. For them, war had always been a matter of dominance, resources, control. A means to expand their empire. For humans, it had become something else. The moment their families, their people civilians, not soldiers, were dragged into the conflict, the nature of the war changed. It was no longer about strategy or tactics. It was about vengeance. Zokari generals watched in horror as entire human battalions fought past what should have been their physical limits. Wounded soldiers who should have retreated pressed forward. Squads that should have crumbled under overwhelming odds refused to fall back. They fought not with desperation, but with purpose. And what disturbed the Zokari the most was that humans weren't just fighting harder. They were adapting, learning. Their tactics became unpredictable, their counterattacks brutal and efficient. The Zokari had studied human biology, their technology, even their psychology. They thought they understood what humans were capable of. But this wasn't in any of their data. The reports began to escalate. Zukari warships ambushed human fleets, only to find themselves lured into traps. Ground forces who had expected a simple occupation were met with relentless ambushes, resistance fighters who moved with a precision far beyond ordinary military training. It was as if every human had become a soldier overnight. A single phrase kept appearing in intercepted transmissions. A phrase the Zukari had no translation for, but one that sent an unmistakable warning: no more mercy. The Zukari leadership convened in a desperate attempt to understand what had gone wrong. Their calculations had been perfect. Their forces had been superior. And yet, for the first time in their long history of conquest, they felt something foreign creeping into their thoughts. Fear. They had made a mistake. A mistake that couldn't be undone. And now, somewhere in the void of space, the first human retaliation fleet was on the move. It was no longer a war. It was a reckoning. A cold silence hung over the Zukari High Command. The projections they had relied on were useless now. Every model they ran, every calculated probability, had failed to predict what was happening. Humanity was no longer fighting a war in the way the Zukari understood it. They weren't playing by the same rules anymore. Across the occupied human colonies, something terrifying had begun to unfold. Zukari patrols started disappearing. Not in large battles, not in coordinated assaults, but in the shadows. Entire squads would leave their barracks for routine patrols and never return. Surveillance drones caught only glimpses, figures moving too fast through the ruins, shapes vanishing into the night. Zukari commanders ordered heavier security measures, but the fear among their soldiers had already taken root. They were being hunted. One report stood out among the rest. A distress call from a forward operating base on the colony world of Vectis 4. The transmission was garbled, but the panic in the officer's voice was unmistakable. There was no coordinated assault, no fleet dropping from orbit. Instead, their own fear had consumed them. The enemy was unseen, silent. And then, just before the signal cut off, one final whisper came through: they don't sleep. They don't stop. In orbit above the planet, a Zukari fleet command ship monitored the situation. From their vantage point, they could see the human retaliation fleet moving through the system like a storm on the horizon. It was unlike anything the Zukari had ever witnessed. There were no hails, no demands for surrender, no attempts at negotiation. Just a slow, relentless advance. One of the Zukari strategists reviewed intercepted human communications. Among the data, they found scattered messages, words that, when put together, painted a picture even their advanced minds struggled to comprehend. They took our people. We take everything back. Pain means nothing. There will be nothing left of them. The Zukari had fought brutal wars before. They had crushed rebellions, obliterated civilizations. But this was different. There was something about humanity's response, something in the way they moved, the way they refused to stop, that unsettled even the most hardened Zukari commanders. Aboard the lead human warship, soldiers prepared in silence. No speeches. No bravado. They didn't need it. The Zukari had already made their choice when they thought humanity could be broken like the others. They had turned a war into something else entirely. The Zukari had unleashed a force they couldn't understand. A force that felt no hesitation. No restraint. As the first human ships breached the outer defenses of the Zukari fleet, a single thought spread through the alien ranks. They hadn't conquered humanity. They had provoked it. And now, there was no turning back. The silence before the storm was suffocating. Zukari warships hovered in tight formations, weapons primed, shields raised to maximum strength. Their commanders watched the human fleet creep closer, an unstoppable force moving without hesitation. There were no last-minute diplomatic attempts, no transmissions demanding surrender. The humans had already decided how this would end. On the bridge of the Zukari flagship, tension crackled like static. Tactical officers ran calculations, predicting firing solutions, searching for any advantage. But deep down, they knew strategy had already failed. Numbers had already failed. This wasn't the enemy they had planned for. Then the first human warship opened fire. A railgun round, moving at incomprehensible speed, tore through the void. It bypassed energy shields like they weren't even there, piercing the hull of a Zukari cruiser and ripping it apart in a silent explosion of debris. The rest of the human fleet followed, launching a storm of kinetic weapons, missile barrages, and focused laser strikes. The Zukari scrambled to return fire, but their shots found nothing but empty space. The humans were faster, more unpredictable. They weaved through destruction like they had already mapped the battlefield before the battle had even begun. Then the boarding craft came. Zukari Marines braced for the fight. They had expected human soldiers fighters they could meet in direct combat, but what they got was something else entirely. The humans fought like ghosts. Shadows in the dim corridors, appearing and disappearing before the Zukari could react. The first squads to engage them never had a chance. The humans struck with brutal precision, moving faster than any battlefield analysis had predicted. Wounded soldiers should have slowed down. They didn't. Fatigue should have caught up to them. It didn't. One Zukari officer watched in horror through a security feed as a group of human soldiers advanced down a smoke-filled corridor. They had taken damage, armor dented, blood smeared across their gear, but they didn't stop. Their eyes burned with something the Zukari couldn't understand. Something terrifying. Survival instincts warred with orders in the minds of the Zukari soldiers. Their empire had taught them discipline, obedience. But standing against these humans, against the sheer force of will that drove them forward, something primal took over. The first Zukari dropped their weapons. Then another. Then entire squads. But surrender wasn't an option anymore. The humans didn't hesitate. They kept moving, kept pushing forward. Every inch of the Zukari fleet, every occupied colony, was being reclaimed. The cost didn't matter. The pain didn't matter. A final, desperate message was sent to the Zukari homeworld. A single transmission from a high-ranking commander, voice shaking, barely able to process what was happening. We didn't break them. We made them worse. The signal cut out, and the humans kept coming. The transmission from the Zukari fleet faded into silence. On the homeworld, the High Council sat frozen, their skin darkening with fear. Never before had they heard such desperation from their military leaders. Never before had they been unable to predict the outcome of a war. The humans should have been manageable and other species to pacify, to assimilate or eliminate. Instead, they had become something else. Something the Zukari had no words for. A desperate order was issued. The core fleets, the last line of defense around the Zukari homeworld, were mobilized. Every warship, every trained soldier was called back. The humans would be met with overwhelming force. The numbers would be on their side this time. This time, there would be no mistakes. But as the fleets repositioned, something unexpected happened. Distress signals flared across Zukari space, not from the front lines, but from deep within their own systems. Communications blacked out. Entire military outposts went silent. Civilian colonies, untouched by war, began sending frantic messages before vanishing from the network. It was as if the war had seeped into their very core, unraveling their empire from within. Then came the most terrifying revelation of all. It wasn't the human fleet doing this. The High Council pulled up surveillance logs from one of their newly lost colonies, expecting to see the brutal efficiency of human shock troops tearing through their forces. But there were no human soldiers. There were no ships. Just abandoned weapons. Empty armor. Signs of battle, but no visible enemy. The Zukari soldiers had disappeared. Panic set in. The humans weren't just reclaiming their territory, they were taking something else. Something the Zukari had never considered. The Council had assumed they were facing an enemy of warriors. Soldiers hardened by war. But it was worse than that. They had created an enemy that no longer needed a battlefield. The reports became more erratic. Entire Zukari battalions defecting, not out of fear, but because something had changed in them. Their minds no longer functioned the same way. They spoke of nightmares when they tried to sleep, of voices whispering in their heads in a language they didn't understand. And worst of all, some of them, those who had spent too much time fighting the humans, began speaking in that language themselves. The war wasn't just a war anymore. The humans had evolved past it, past vengeance, past survival. They had become something beyond the Zukari's ability to comprehend. And whatever that was, it was already here. The High Council realized too late. The warships they had called back to protect the homeworld were never going to arrive. Because the humans were already on the ground. The Zukari homeworld had never seen war on its own soil. The streets, lined with towering structures of glass and steel, had been built in confidence fortresses of an empire that believed itself untouchable. Now they were empty. Silent. The sky above, once bustling with trade ships and diplomatic envoys, was littered with burning wreckage. The human fleet had arrived. But it wasn't the ships the Zokari feared anymore. It was what came after. The High Council's last defenses had collapsed before they even understood what was happening. Their elite soldiers, their most advanced weapons, had been rendered useless. Some fought and fell, their weapons ineffective against an enemy that didn't stop, that didn't retreat. Others simply stood in shock, their minds unraveling under the weight of something they couldn't name. They had trained for war, but this wasn't war anymore. A lone council member, trembling, stared at the security feeds from the planetary command center. The screens flickered with distorted images, human soldiers advancing through the city, untouched by exhaustion, their eyes cold and unreadable. But there was something else. Among them were Zokari. Their own people, marching alongside the enemy, their expressions hollow, their bodies moving as if pulled by an unseen force. They had not been captured. They had not been forced. They had simply changed. A message broke through the static, cutting across every remaining communication channel on the planet. A human voice, steady and calm, spoke in the Zokari language. This is not conquest. This is understanding. The words sent shivers through the council chamber. Understanding? There was no understanding in this. The Zokari had studied human warfare, had dissected their tactics, their resilience, their raw aggression. But they had missed something. Something deeper. Then, the final horror set in. The humans had not just adapted to war. They had adapted to the Zokari themselves. Every battle, every moment of brutality, every desperate fight for survival had changed them, not just physically, not just mentally, but in a way the Zokari's science could not explain. The war had not hardened the humans. It had opened them. And now, the Zokari were changing too. Across the city, Zokari civilians who had never seen battle collapsed to their knees, gripping their heads as if something was crawling inside their minds. Soldiers who had fought in the war zones fell silent, their eyes distant, their voices speaking words in a language that wasn't theirs. They had been exposed to something. Something that could not be undone. In the council chamber, the last remaining leader whispered in horror. "We let them in." Outside, the human soldiers reached the steps of the chamber. They did not raise their weapons. They did not need to. The heavy doors of the council chamber groaned as they opened. The few remaining Zokari leaders pressed themselves against the walls, their bodies trembling, their minds teetering on the edge of collapse. The humans stepped inside, not as conquerors, not as invaders, but as something else. Their presence filled the room, not with force, but with an overwhelming sense of inevitability. The lead human removed their helmet, revealing a face that should have looked exhausted from war, but there was no weariness in their eyes. There was only clarity. They looked at the council, at the leaders of a species that had once seen itself as untouchable, and spoke with quiet certainty. It never had to be like this. The words settled in the silence, heavier than any weapon. The Zokari had thought they understood war, had thought they understood the limits of suffering, of endurance, of strategy. But they had been blind to the truth. Humanity had not won through superior weapons or tactics. They had won because they had evolved beyond the battle itself. One of the council members collapsed to their knees, gripping their head, their breath shallow. The others could feel it, too, something shifting inside them, something irreversible. It wasn't a disease. It wasn't mind control. It was understanding. The war had forced humanity to change, and now, through some force beyond logic, beyond science, the Zokari were changing too. The lead human stepped forward and crouched in front of the trembling leader. "Your people will survive," they said, "but they will never be the same." The war had ended without a final battle. No grand declaration of victory. No surrender. Just silence, spreading like a wave across the planet, across the empire, as the Zokari came to a realization they could never have prepared for. The humans left as suddenly as they had arrived. Their ships rose from the cities, from the broken battlefields, leaving no destruction in their wake. There was nothing left to fight. Nothing left to take. As the last of the human fleet disappeared into the void, the Zokari homeworld remained still. Their empire had not fallen. Their cities still stood. But their people had been reshaped in ways they could never undo. The war had not destroyed them. It had rewritten them. And somewhere, In the depths of the stars, humanity continued forward. Unstoppable, unchanged, or perhaps forever changing.